And first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Tony Shannon. So Tony is the head of digital services in the Office Government CIO for Ireland. And Tony will discuss and inspire us on the topic of common building blocks and how common building blocks may be helpful, scalable, and bring sustainable solutions for the energy sector. So welcome, Tony. The floor is yours.
Merci, Lucien. Merci. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Let me just jump to my slides for a second. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Lucien said, I've come over from Dublin, from Ireland. We met when the LFE Foundation was over in Dublin last September, and I'm very delighted to be here today to be speaking with you all. I'm here for several reasons, and not least of which is I wanted to dedicate this talk to Shuli Goodman, who I spoke to 2 weeks before her death, and there's not too many people I find at my age that I find inspiring, but she definitely inspired me, and I'm very grateful to the work that she began, because it's one of the reasons I'm here and the reasons you're all here. But I'm grateful to you all too, because I believe you're all here because you know that we're at a time in history and a moment that matters, and a decade that matters, to address the challenges of our times for people and planet, where we need to cooperate and collaborate to address the big challenges that we face. And let me begin by telling you my own story. I'm not from the energy sector, I'm from the emergency medicine sector. I was a physician for 20 years. And I could tell you stories about people at the front line. But I won't dwell on that. Let me talk to you about one of the reasons why the healthcare industry is in trouble and challenged around the world. It's because of the state of the health IT sector, which is full of proprietary software that doesn't interoperate very well, and so people suffer all over the place. And it's one of the reasons that I got involved in the work of digital, to try to help the staff work smarter, not harder. And I was trying to understand why we had such difficulties in the healthcare sector, and I started not just to learn about medicine and management and technology, but also economics and what was going on. Why did we have such a dysfunctional IT market in the sector? And I believe it's because of the economic model that we have been trying to work through for the last number of years. And I believe we're now at a point where we need a new economic model. And this is from a great book I recommend to everybody. It's called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. And it talks about a lot of things, but it talks about changing from measuring things like GDP alone to a more balanced scorecard, where we measure the social foundation on which we need to look after the people we serve, be that give them food, healthcare, education, shelter, and the outer ecological ceiling, the planet that we need to live on and look after. And of course, countries around the world, including my own in Ireland, we're failing at this at the moment, but at least it gives us a view of the work we need to do, which is to get inside that donut. And from the same book, another great visual that helped me understand where I fitted in the whole piece talks about the earth, society, the economy, and 4 key players: the household, where you and I live; the market, which has been all important for many decades; the emerging and always important role of the state in our lives; and then at the bottom, the role of the commons. And I'm here particularly to talk about the vital role of the commons that has been neglected for so long now lately. And again, sticking with my own personal journey, having worked in the emergency department for 20 years and identified the problems in the health IT sector, I ended up setting up a small non-profit foundation called Ripple Foundation quite a few years ago, which was aimed at trying to seed digital commons in the healthcare sector. And we focused on 3 key open source components. And I've long been a very strong advocate for open source in that sector. But we built 3 building blocks: one for the user interface, one for integration, and one for data models and a data repository. And I realized you know, as I was doing that actually, of course, I wasn't alone. There were many other people internationally who are now moving into this space. So Digital Square, their move for global goods. There was a recognition around the world that actually if we want to solve the problems of healthcare, we need to work together and develop goods in common. And I then came across this paper, which I would recommend to any of you interested in this space, around from the UNITU, which talks about a whole of government approach to investing in digital technologies to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And it uses a couple of brilliant illustrations, including this one, which talks about if you're trying to solve problems in agriculture, healthcare, education, whatever your use case is, there are patterns there. There are generic workflows that need to be understood and generic building blocks. And if you can get those building blocks right, then you can change the world. Okay, so that was my own personal journey up to the point that I moved, and I'll tell you about my move in a minute. But what I want to do now is talk about other moves that were happening elsewhere in the world that you guys are all aware of. I won't need to spend long here, but just to make a couple of key points. First of all, we've seen a major shift in the software industry. We know that the days of commercial off-the-shelf software have, I believe, had their day. We have already seen a shift towards software as a service, proprietary software, though, as a service. And I'm particularly interested in what's happened in the last 10 years, where we've seen open source software just transform the software industry. And it's not just those of us who believe it's for the common good, but it's also because this is a commercial angle to be made. And actually, there's a win-win here for both. So what we see now is a rise in open source software. And again, it's transforming the world. I don't need those of you who know the Linux Foundation to know about the power of open source components, that are again transforming the world of the cloud, which most people, of course, don't know about, but it is the vital infrastructure that underpins the cloud that is transforming our lives, these open source components. And I think the Linux Foundation has done a stellar job of trying to build that approach globally. So let me just then reflect a very similar visual from the Digital Impact Alliance and the work of the UNITU, which is again looking at common components. So these are the idea of common components that are not just useful for the market, but useful for the state and for government. And they've identified just 23, 24 building blocks, as I say earlier, that could transform government. And they've already been identified. They're listed in their view of the common components in the commons. And I think, to me, that shows tremendous overlap and synergies between market and state players here. And if you look at what's happening with those components, particularly in areas like the Global South, you'll see that there's massive momentum building around this kind of open source component work for digital government. Which brings me to GovStack, which is an initiative that took off from the UNITU a couple of years ago, and we've been tracking it and reasonably closely involved with it since, and is essentially saying that actually, if we want to transform 21st century government, we just need to identify a small number of building blocks and cooperate and collaborate on those together. And so that's the tactic that we're taking now in the Irish government. And essentially what we're talking about here is building blocks that are digital for the public good to build the infrastructure for the 21st century. We're at that moment now at that time when we're building the future through this building block approach. So let me pause there now and just bring you up to date with what's happening. I've talked about my own journey. I've talked about what's been happening elsewhere across the other sectors. Let me bring you back right up to date now with what's happening now in the Irish government in this space before I turn to you all. So the Government of Ireland obviously has a responsibility for those people who we look after in terms of their cradle-to-grave lives. And I use that term because we are looking at trying to shift from looking after civil servants to citizens and trying to make sure that we're looking after them when they need us most. And what may have been a fairly minor role in digital terms prior to COVID was transformed by the COVID pandemic when we had to respond to the needs of the people by making available information to explain to people what was happening. And gov.ie, essentially the platform that we build on, essentially became vital to people's day-to-day activities, as what they were and were not able to do, and how they could get help, etc. Then what the EU did was that EU took a lead on the idea of vaccinations and vaccination certs at scale, and the EU Digital COVID Certificate. We were thrown into that with a couple of weeks' notice, and effectively had to quickly stand up a solution that allowed us to reopen society and travel to begin again. And you won't be surprised to know that there was a significant open source component to that initiative that transformed people's lives. And that then has led us to the thinking, and we're not alone, we're one of many governments that are now looking at life events. And again, just to make the point, we're talking about cradle to grave life events. We're talking about very important times in people's lives, be they births, marriages, deaths, buying a house, arriving as a refugee, coming back as an immigrant, starting a business, driving, whatever those life events are in people's lives. We know that they turn to the government or the public sector for help, and we want to be involved in supporting them at that hour of need. So the way we're doing that is we're building essentially a life event service on a set of open source building blocks. And we're aligning those with the GovStack initiative, and I've identified 7 that I call the seamless 7 that we're trying to weave together as key components, using a model that we've been calling in Ireland the build to share model. There are things like digital identity, we need to know who we're dealing with, content management, how do you provide information to people, the concept of data collection. There's often a form or data that needs to be passed to the civil servant, then a case management solution where the application is processed, messaging, the idea of notifying people about where their application is, and then information mediation, this idea of moving data between different government departments, as well as analytics on top. These are generic building blocks that we're bringing together to underpin a service that should be transformative across a range of different life events. And hopefully you're beginning to see some of the common ground in the building blocks. I'm going to put to you that there's common ground here. The target in technical terms of a lot of these is now being aimed at what you might call a digital wallet. There's an EU digital wallet being planned, but essentially the idea would be if you're applying for one of many services that I mentioned, that you'd end up with a digital credential that you'd be able to then use for whatever you need thereafter. So the idea would be a government-issued wallet and a government set of credentials. And essentially that's where we're at this point in time, trying to address the digital decade that we have to address in front of us. We're under major pressure to digitalize services, but also to think about how we do that in a green way. Okay, so let me now turn to how we can look more closely at what's happening here. And I'm going to try for a couple of minutes just to talk about patterns. These are patterns that I see. I may be the naive one in the room who doesn't really know what I'm talking about, but when I look at the energy sector, these are some of the patterns that I see. I see common ground between the governments and the energy sector and LF Energy, etc., around this concept of trying to address both people and planet. I think my sense is that's a shared goal here. I see common ground in an understanding that actually it's the commons and the digital commons that's going to transform the 21st century. And you're transforming the energy sector by investing together in the digital commons. I believe you won't argue with me too much about the idea of common components in the commons and the idea that we're all building those together. So I won't need to dwell there, because essentially that is effectively the basis of the LF energy landscape as we see it today, which is thriving very quickly and moving at pace. And I'm not here to dwell on the detail of the projects or the architecture that you've got that underpin LF Energy, but to probe with a couple of questions as to where there may now be common ground between the work you're doing in the energy sector for the planet and the work that we're doing across government for the people. Before I pin those down, let me talk about 2 things: patterns in the arts. We need to talk about language, because different people use different words to mean different things. And obviously language is a very vibrant thing that takes time to find a common language. But as we know, for good or for bad, we are converging on a common language in the sense that I'm able to just come to you here and speak in English, and I must excuse myself en français, but English is how I speak to you today. Patterns in the sciences. This is the early view of the elements. Any view of those who studied chemistry knows that is not the view of the periodic table of the elements today, but that was the view at that point in time in history. And I would put to you that if you look at the building blocks and the software that we're working at today, we're at about a similar stage. We still are building the periodic table of the software elements. So, what can I probe you on and provoke debate and discussion? Let me talk about these building blocks. These are the 24 building blocks that have been identified across governments internationally as being suitable for the people. Very quickly run through them, see if you recognize any of them. Analytics, business intelligence, artificial intelligence, case management, collaboration management, consent and content management, data collection, digital registries, learning and marketplace, geographical information services, identity verification. Information mediation, messaging, mobility, payments, registration, reporting, scheduling, security, shared data, terminology, and workflow. Let me then give you a scenario. If I'm at home in Dublin and I'm interested, as I am, in the energy sector, I've been studying it recently. I've gotten myself a little bit of a certificate in renewable energy because I'm very interested in this space, and I know as a parent I need to do something about the planet. And I wanted to put solar panels on my roof, and I wanted to cooperate with my neighbours and build together a virtual power plant. Where would I get the building blocks? What would those building blocks be like? To my mind, I might look for things like a geographical information element, a data collection element, perhaps a workflow element, certainly a terminology element to bring the components together. I'd surely need some information mediation between the components. There surely would be some cause potentially for analytics. At the end of it, there may or may not in time be the role for artificial intelligence. But my sense is, and again I'm here to be proved wrong, that common building blocks that I'm articulating here today are those that are required to build the virtual power plant of the future. If I'm anyway right at all, but happy to be proved wrong, then if it works for a village, it should work for a town and a city. Those same building blocks scale up and they scale out. They're scalable and sustainable. And if that's right, then there's no reason why the same building blocks that we're cooperating again for the people that we serve and the planet that we need to look after can't be cooperated on and collaborated on to transform the energy sector and the lives whose people we're serving together. And that's my hypothesis today as to whether there's common ground here within those building blocks. So let me finish by again going back to where I started and saying that I believe we're at a time in history and a decade that matters and a moment that matters. We don't have a lot of time to waste. We need to work together to move faster together to address the challenges that we face for people and planet. I've talked about the work that we've been doing at a government level and that are happening at governments around the world in trying to address these with building blocks for the people. And I'm here to provoke a bit of debate and discussion, I hope, around whether there's common ground with those same building blocks for the planet. Because if there is, then there's room for cooperation and collaboration at a scale we haven't maybe thought about before. And I'll finish there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks a lot, Tony.